little bit about cybercrime prosecutions in the United States and the difficulties prosecutors have in these cases. Let's listen in.
Gets caught, 10,000 go free, and maybe even more. And in fact, in the United States, only 3 in 1,000 malicious cyber incidents will even see an arrest. It's very difficult to prosecute cybercrime. And this is what's been made very clear. When you look at prosecutions of cybercrime, 6 elements pop up that make it difficult to prosecute. The first being attribution. It is very difficult to be able to find out who exactly the hacker was. And that I find is the most difficult problem for prosecutors in identifying who the hacker is and then explaining that to the jury. The second element that's difficult is sometimes the hacker can be a state actor from other countries, and then that would make it very difficult to extradite and prosecute. Another issue is some of the hackers can be minors. And what we found is, for example, in the Lapsus hacker transnational group, which was based mainly out in the UK and Brazil, those hackers were minors. And so it's very difficult to prosecute minors and actually have some sort of punishment that acts as a deterrent. A lot of the Lapsus members involved these juvenile members. And I'll just give you one example. For example, the City of London police arrested 7 juveniles in relation to the Lapsus group. But shortly after the arrest, Lapsus announced it was back from vacation and posted teaser screenshots of exfiltrated data and administrator credentials on its channel. So that can also be that can be difficult. Another problem that we see is international cooperation. If you can't get extradition or if you can't get the information needed to prosecute a cybercrime, there's no such thing as an internet police. The best that I've seen actually is the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime. The Budapest Convention provides for the criminalization of conduct ranging from illegal access, data and systems interference to computer-related fraud and child pornography, procedural powers to investigate cybercrime and secure electronic evidence, and its efficient international cooperation. So here we do see some international cooperation, and it's a benefit to their members because the convention provides this legal framework for international cooperation, and it provides for additional tools for enhanced cooperation. And the members of the Cybercrime Convention Committee, they share experiences, information, assess implementation of the convention, and they engage with each other in trusted and efficient cooperation. So I think that's a benefit, but I still believe it's very difficult to get this type of international cooperation for the successful prosecution of cybercrimes. The other issues that I see in prosecuting cybercrime is understanding computer forensics. It's kind of a specialized niche in the sense of you're going to have to understand what an IP address is, proxy servers, user credentials, secure shells, virtual private networks, hashing algorithms. So you really have to have some sort of additional area of expertise to understand the computer forensics associated with identifying hackers. It's also important to understand the cyber laws. Let's be honest, they're a bit difficult to read. So you really have to be able to understand what those cyber laws require as far as elements and to be able to explain that to a jury or a judge. And lastly, this is going to require a lot of presenting IT evidence in the courtroom. This can be difficult, and jurors and the judge have to be basically taught the basics of these computer forensics to understand the implications of such evidence. So I figured I'd go ahead and use an example of a successful cybercrime trial to see how these elements can be overcome in the difficulties in prosecuting cybercrime. This was the case of Evgeny Nikulin, and he was charged with multiple counts of using and selling stolen usernames and passwords in violation of 1029E2, installing malware on protected computers in violation of 1030A5, conspiracy, computer intrusion in violation of 1030A2C, and aggravated identity theft. And if you look at these elements, right, they're very similar. In 1029A in fraud, you basically have to prove that the defendant knowingly trafficked in unauthorized access devices. So he stole credentials. He obtained something of value worth $1,000 or more. He had the intent to defraud, and that conduct affected interstate commerce. 1030 basically focuses on intentionally accessing a computer without authorization. So when he put a malicious software, Madness, onto a LinkedIn employee's iMac, right, he would basically be intentionally accessing a protected computer and as a result causing damage and loss. And lastly, identity theft that you see here is basically he was impersonating the employees by using a means of identity without authority. And we would have to prove that he would know the means of the identity, that it belongs to a real person. And in doing so, he was basically committing fraud without unlawful authority. And I'm just pointing out here that several countries throughout the world have similar laws. Here's the hacking law in Poland, where, again, it's obtaining access not intended for him by opening computer information, requires a penalty of 2 years. Here we have in Indonesia a very similar law. Any person without authority accessing electronic systems of another person or carries out an interception of electronic information of other persons or transmitting non-public electronic information. These are all very similar laws that you see throughout the world. So what did they do in Nakulin? Well, what we found in Nakulin was the prosecutor here, Michelle Kane, she was trying to put the point of like, look, you're going to learn a lot of computer forensics. You are going to present to you a lot of IT evidence. But in fact, hacking is just simple theft. I think it's important for us to understand that this sounds complicated, but in the end, hacking is the same as theft. Unfortunately, though, what we see is that this information can be considered boring. And the judge was basically simply commenting to that during the trial to the prosecutor of like, look, you potentially could get jurors that are going to fall asleep because this is very boring information. That's a challenge that prosecutors have to overcome. The defense in the case, Adam Gassner, he used his cross-examinations many times to challenge the computer forensics, to basically explain to the jury through a cross-examination that, look, IP addresses can't definitely tell you who did the hacking or even where the information was sent from. And again, time and time again during the trial, what we find is the deeper dive that you go into IT evidence, IP addresses and proxy servers, browser cookies, user agent string, these were all data points to identify the hacker, and the emails used revealed the content of the hacker. Very important to come across to juries, but in a way that they can understand that. And so here we see a lot of pushback sometimes by the court saying that some of these things that are being introduced for the jury can sometimes be confusing. And is it irrelevant? Another thing that kind of popped out at the trial that I noticed was that they used jailhouse calls that the defendant made to his friends or his girlfriend to prove that he, in fact, was interested in computers, computer magazines. Some of this, the judge kind of pushed back again to say, what's the relevance of the call? But there was one point that a jailhouse call was used in when he said, the defendant said, I hacked 24/7, which could help support the argument that he, in fact, does hack And so he could be the one that committed the hacking in this case, which was the hacking of LinkedIn, Formspring, and Dropbox. Another cross that we saw a lot is of a particular issue of whether this was a state actor that did it, and that Nakulam was kind of used as a scapegoat. And again, this brings up the difficulty of trusting this international cooperation and the evidence that you get from a foreign country. For example, in Russia, can we trust the fact that Russia said the IP address was attached to Nikulin? Can we trust this international information? So that comes up a lot on cross-examination by the defense, pointing out, are you able to do any kind of independent inquiry to support that, in fact, that IP address came from Nikulin, and the government could not. And another cross-examination that was used is pointing out that the emails used during the hacking, one of the big emails, China Big, was actually in someone else's name, not Nikulin's name, and they used a German language code, again, to convince the jury that, in fact, attribution here does not apply and that their defendant is not, in fact, the hacker. In closing argument, what you noticed in the defense's closing is they really did focus on this idea of the Russian government providing misinformation to the United States. And in fact, he explains again how a proxy server can basically mask the true IP address of the particular hacker. And so they made a big point in the defense closing to point that out. Meanwhile, the prosecution really focused on their theme throughout the trial, which is follow the digital breadcrumbs. And so they started with the email that was associated with the hack, ChinaBig01 @gmail, which was responsible for all 3 hacks. And they showed that that IP address that was used in the LinkedIn hack was the defendant's address per the MLAT information they received from Russia. And they pointed out that it had the longest VPN connection, which lasted over 2 days. And so it was a huge 3 gigabyte transfer of data at that point when that computer was said to have been residing in Nikulin's residence. They then connected that email address, China Big, to this other email, Rutaka, which was also used in the LinkedIn and Dropbox accounts that were used with tampering. So they were able to dive into that Gmail account and found that that Gmail account was controlled by the defendant Nikulin. And therefore, the prosecution was able to prove through the digital breadcrumbs that if we can identify the original email that was used for the attacks, tie it to the second email, the defendant is in fact the hacker. And they were successful, because what we find is through all the statutory maximum penalties, Nikulin actually received 88 months in prison based on these hacks. And so in conclusion, I would just say, yes, there are difficulties in prosecuting cybercrime. We've listed several of these today. However, it can be successfully overcome with international cooperation and with explaining to a jury or a judge the computer forensics and cybercrime laws that circle the hacking itself. And it is possible to prosecute.